Hi, today we see the week 10 coming to an end. We just finished getting your case study in. Very interesting case studies. I hope you feel comfortable with them. And I also hope that you got a sense of understanding of the risk modeling and the other techniques, sensitivity analysis, and Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is pretty interesting, and it's surprising how often it is still used. And also, with you looking at that Appendix D in the practice standard, I would think that you would feel that you've got a better understanding and handle on some of these qualitative and quantitative methods for looking at risk and assessing risk. And if you have any questions, I'm looking forward to hearing from you. This week, in our summary, a course summary, we're going to be looking at the risk factors, bringing it all together now, bringing it all together, coming into focus. Our risk response matrix, looking at that, and then performance tracking and technical performance measurement regarding what we're doing about risk and risk mitigation. This week, I want to follow up on the example that we went through last week, where I took you through the process of how we were looking at the currency, or how we would monitor and how often we would be looking at risk and risk assessment, what was happening at risk, with risk amongst the projects, how we were communicating it, and some of the tools that we were using to report it. This week I want to sort of follow up on that, like an appendix to that. And I have this risk assessment chart up here. I want to bring this to your attention because it is the kind of chart you could use after you've plotted and sorted out your risks and decided which ones were important, which ones are critical, which ones you needed to follow, which ones you were going to monitor but not do much about. At that point, after you've finished with your risk assessment and you're fundamentally done with the initial analysis of risk and what you're going to do with it, it might be a good time to use a chart, something like this, to plot your risks on. Put them on the grid somewheres. Set this up not in lieu of quantitative measurements of the risk impact or the risk probability, but just like a qualitative pictorial view of how you would plot the risks that you're tracking on here, and how you would put them on this type of plot. And we look at occurrence across the bottom. That's the probability. We might break it up. This is broken up into 5 sections. They could be like 20% sections. And then going up the severity, that could be whatever your range of impact is. That could break that up into 20% elements, all the way up to the most catastrophic that you're currently monitoring. And then take a look at your risk exposure, plot it on here, and then looking at this same graph, but in a way to decide how you want to approach reducing the impact of your risk. And this presents a way to look at it on 2 axes. In other words, there's 2 things that you might want to do. You want to figure out how to reduce the impact, and that's bringing it down from up there in the middle of the unacceptable risk area down closer to an acceptable risk area. And then the second one would be to try and decide, what can I do to reduce the probability of this occurring? And that's what would move it to the left. By looking at these 2 actions separately and independently, it might give you some ideas on how you might address your risk, how you might mitigate it to get it into an area, into an acceptable risk area, where the severity is not that great and also the probability of occurrence is much less. And so taking the previous chart, plotting your risks on there, and then looking at it from this way, this is the same chart, and take a look at it to what I might do to reduce the impact. Let's move it down vertically. And then is there anything I can do to reduce the probability of it occurring? Okay. And there are some risks that you can do those things with. Not every risk, but there are some that you can. The kind of risks that have to do with staffing, key employees, subject matter experts, things like that, you actually can do a lot to reduce the probability of occurrence. In other words, if someone really buys into the project, and if they really feel at home and they feel like they're creating great value, they feel needed and used and appreciated, they got a much less tendency to want to leave and go to another assignment, or to actually leave the company, go to another company where you would lose their capability. So food for thought, something for you to think about. Also, when we talk about mitigation, here's some practical examples of possible strategies that's a little bit more esoteric. If we're looking at preventative strategies, try to look at risks that may originate in technical organizations or some kind of organizational issues. Try to eliminate them, identify what they are, and see if there's some way to neutralize them. If it's something to do with a project process that makes things difficult for the project or control, what you might do is launch some additional studies or some additional work on trying to reduce the impact or the probability of a risk, trying to reduce the severity. Okay, insurance is a good one. Fallback plans. If you can identify solutions early enough in a case of an event occurs, you might be able to have that early solution in place, possibly implemented a little bit, that would make a big difference on the severity of a risk event should it occur. And then there's some more complicated or complex strategies where we do a combination of things. Shared responsibility. We work with other units, other divisions in the company or other projects to try and see how we might work together to mitigate a potential risk event. Working with co-contractors. Setting up some rules of interface, how we're going to work together. Another thing is to transfer to subcontractors and suppliers. Sometimes subcontractors are in much better position to reduce the severity and the probability of impact of a risk. For instance, if you've got a construction project and you need to rent a backhoe because you've got to excavate some area, it might reduce a lot of the risk of accidents and other things if possibly, in addition to renting the backhoe, you might also have them provide an operator to operate the backhoe. That operator would probably be far more experienced than possibly somebody that doesn't sit on a backhoe all day. And then another mixed strategy regarding management, control the rules of the contingency utilization. In other words, make sure that if there's a contingency that occurs, that how you going to implement, how you going to manage it or block it off. Financing of control actions, and then any corrective actions that you have implemented to mitigate risk. Closely monitor how effective is it. Is there anything you can do to change that corrective action, to modify it slightly or add to it, which would improve the effect that it's having on the risk event? Things to think about. Okay. Also, when you're looking at risks, take a look at the classification, whether they're product risks, contractual type risks, and then you can look at what is the type of mitigation you intend to use for that, and with that, whether it's in product risk information purchase, there's things you can do by you will need to have more information. You can do modeling, prototyping, do some analysis, market analysis, user group, all kinds of things you can find additional information on. Contractual risks, we haven't really talked about contracts per se in this course yet, but there's contingencies that you can prepare for, preventive measures you can take. For instance, you're getting a specification that you're going to be contractually obligated to deliver to. It's possible to have that specification validated before you sign off on it. Make sure the quality plan that you intend to follow as a part of the contract and the development plan. Then there's causal elimination. How are you going to make sure that you got a good contract? You can take measures in negotiations and the way you set up the estimate. Your company might do some factoring, selling of receivables, and then also have some type of operational safety study that you want to implement before you actually start the project and have a signed contract. Changing the slide, looking at the reserves, the risk reserves right now. This is a pretty illuminating picture. What we're really saying in this picture here is that if we look at the left side, we have the project budget without any risk reserve. This is what the should cost is. This is what the project budget is to do the work. No contingency, no fat, no reserves in there. Just what it takes to do the project. And then we have a number of risks, a large number of risks. And if we look at the impact of the risks, it might say that it requires a large reserve to address those risks should they occur. And that requires a large commitment of funds to be able to develop that risk reserve. And then, of course, on top of that, if this project is being done as a form of revenue generation, then there's a profit margin that goes on top of the project that the company wants to appreciate. Then as we move from the left towards the right, what we're really doing is going through the process of evaluating our risks and our risk management, doing our risk assessments, checking the probability of them, coming up with steps of mitigation, maybe looking at the different strategies for risk avoidance, whether we cut it out of the project, whether we just leave it in there. What are the four basic fundamental strategies that we talked about a few weeks ago? And we look at what we can do to mitigate the risks, to reduce the impact of them should they occur, and also try to provide some mitigation that probably we might even get into risk avoidance. And while we're going from this beginning state before we worked on the risks till we get satisfied, this is an area of cost uncertainty. We don't know where the costs are right now. We know that the project budget cost estimate is not going to change, but we're really focused mainly on what we're going to do with this risk reserve that we need. How well can we mitigate these risks? How well can we get this potential risk picture under control? And as we come to the end of that process, where we have decided which risks are going to be mitigated, which ones are going to be avoided, which ones we're going to accept, which ones we're going to transfer, whatever those strategies are, we come to the final picture where we have now taken the risk reserve and for the mitigated risks, the risks that we're going to face, and it's a lot smaller number. Now you notice that in that right-hand picture, cost for the project is increased. The increase is the risk mitigation budget. In other words, if you recall from last week, any mitigation actions that we take that have a cost associated with them, we have got to pay for now, even if the risk doesn't occur or even before the risk event might occur. We've got to take the mitigation to be prepared in the event that the risk event occurs. So that means that we have got to add to our project budget the amount of funding it takes to finance or pay for our risk mitigation activities. And that's the risk mitigation budget that you see added onto the project budget. At that point, we have a much smaller reserve requirement for our risks because of our mitigation and because of our risk management actions. And you can see how that vertical amount has been reduced, and then the profit margin stays the same and goes on top of it. But now we have got a project that is ready to be presented to management, ready to be presented, submitted to a customer or to a sponsor. And what we have four elements in the in the project cost picture. And that is our project budget without the risk reserve, the amount of funding it takes to do the project. Then comes the mitigation budget, which is the amount of funding required to pay for the mitigation actions we're going to take against the risk. And then we have our reserve for the risks that have been mitigated. And then on top of that is our profit margin. And then the total amount of these four elements constitutes the total price or total cost for our project. Okay? So looking at our risk management process just from a different perspective a little bit. We can take a look at, in summary now, looking back on what we just talked about, looking back on previous weeks, looking back on all of this. We can address the risk in the project initiation cycle, in the planning cycle, in the execution cycle. And we really want to continuously address risk throughout the life cycle of the project. And there are a few things we can do. We can put up a risk analysis committee to periodically look at it. We can do go, no-go committee meetings, whether we're going to go or not go with a certain activity. Are we going to do bid, no bid? Are we going to do make, buy decisions? In the beginning, when we're before we submit the proposal, reviewing it, having project reviews during the project, making sure we have risk reviews. Lots of dynamic activities that we can take that keeps us current on the status of our risks and also keeps us current on what the project status looks like and how we're doing on the risks that we've taken under mitigation or the risk events that have happened, and how are we recovering from those. We want to do that, work on these risks, engaging our team and other stakeholders. And we can occasionally, not every day or every week, but have team risk sessions, have set up design work groups, third-party reviews, whatever we want, but we should make sure that we got good and open communications with our team, with our stakeholders, our management, and our customer community. Have a good, dynamic, healthy risk management process. Very important. Finally, just another example for you, for your consideration, of a risk register. This one's just a brief summary talking about, left column is the number, then comes the risk, the impact occurrence, what kind of impact it has, what if you want to have a class of risks, what action are we taking, what's the cost of it, who's responsible for it, when is it going to be in 1 month or another month or a quarter or whatever, and what the status is, and you can make up your own legend for status, whatever floats your boat, or anything like that that satisfies the way you want to look at your risks and the kind of register you want to put together to look at that. So that's for this week. Next week is our final case study. That's going to be a final exam case study, and you're going to look at Pritchard chapters 34, 35, and Appendix A and D, and there are 4 topics there: risk reviews and audits, other common techniques, contractor risk management. Recall that many of you are going to have subcontracts with other vendors, and you've got to make sure that they have some form of risk management and that you're managing them, the risks that having a contractor entails. And also, even if you're not subcontracting, but you're using temporary labor or consultants or anything like that, that's the same boat, same generic classification. That is, you want to watch out and make sure you got good contractor risk management. And then also quantifying expert judgment. If you need to bring in some experts or you need expert judgment, it's a good section, and it's a good way to wrap up this text, and we'll bring this quarter together. Have a great week. I'm looking forward to seeing your wrap-up work, and then next week we'll have the final case study. I wish you well, and I hope all the very best for each of you.